September 2nd, 1457. The mountains of Albania. An Ottoman army, 80,000 strong, marched into a narrow valley, convinced the war was already finished. They did not deploy for battle. They prepared for rest. Because waiting for them was only one man, Georgi Kastrioti Skanderbeg. He commanded 8,000 soldiers. By noon, 30,000 Ottomans would be dead, 15,000 would be taken prisoner, and the Sultan himself would stare at the reports and declare them impossible. Narrator. To understand why this happened, you must understand the world that came before it. 4 years earlier, the unthinkable had become reality. Constantinople fell. A city that had stood for 1,000 years collapsed in smoke, fire, and thunder. With it fell more than walls. An idea died. The idea that the Ottomans could be stopped. They did not merely defeat an empire, they proved inevitability. Kingdoms vanished, borders folded inward. Armies chose survival over resistance. Europe did not rise, it held its breath. Because when an empire believes it cannot lose, resistance stops being heroic. It becomes suicide. But in the mountains of Albania, inevitability met refusal. Skanderbeg was not born a rebel. He was forged by the enemy, raised in the Ottoman court, trained by their generals, educated in discipline, maneuver, and fear. He spoke their language. He understood their thinking. He knew how Ottoman commanders behaved when they believed victory was guaranteed. For 14 years, he turned that knowledge into defiance. He did not defeat the empire in open battle. He bled it, ambush after ambush, delay after delay. Never decisive enough to end the war. Always precise enough to keep it alive. Until the Ottomans decided patience was over. This time, they did not send a force to punish. They sent an army to erase. 40,000 infantry, battle-hardened veterans. 20,000 cavalry, trained to crush resistance. Another 20,000 to supply, repair, and occupy. And guiding them through the mountains was a man who knew every Albanian weakness. Skanderbeg's own nephew. Blood had chosen empire over blood. To the Ottomans, the campaign was already won. They were not hunting an army. They were collecting territory. And then, Skanderbeg disappeared. As the Ottoman army advanced, they found nothing. No scouts, no resistance, no signs of war. Villages stood empty, watchtowers silent. Days passed. Confidence grew. The enemy had fled. What the Ottomans did not understand was that an army does not need to be visible to be present. Skanderbeg was not retreating. He was positioning history. The valley he chose was called Tumanishta, long, narrow, steep on 3 sides. To Ottoman commanders, it looked perfect. Natural protection, water nearby, space for a massive camp. To Skanderbeg, it was geometry, a place where numbers would collide with themselves, where sound would multiply, where smoke would blind, where panic would have nowhere to go. That night, 80,000 men slept. Cooking fires flickered across the valley floor. Weapons were cleaned. Horses were fed. They slept believing the danger had passed. Above them, 8,000 men waited in silence. No fires, no metal clatter, no voices. They moved by memory, not light. By the early hours of dawn, every unit was in position, and then they waited. At first light, the horn sounded, not once, but everywhere. The valley answered. Arrows fell from 3 directions at once. Men died before they understood they were under attack. Horses panicked, tearing through tents and supply lines. Veteran soldiers froze. Because discipline depends on clarity, and clarity was gone. Battle cries echoed endlessly, multiplied by stone and slope. It sounded like an army far larger than reality. Then came the smoke. Fires ignited along the heights. The morning wind pushed blindness downward. Units fired at movement and killed their own. Commands overlapped. Languages clashed. Order dissolved. 80,000 soldiers became 80,000 individuals, trapped in a shrinking space, trying to survive. By noon, resistance no longer existed. The valley was filled with bodies. The exits were blocked by the dead. 30,000 lay where they fell. 15,000 surrendered. Skanderbeg stood victorious, not because he was stronger, but because he understood something empires forget. Numbers do not win wars. Control does. Fear does. And on September 2nd, 1457, 8,000 men proved that even the mightiest empire can bleed if it walks into the wrong valley. Before the valley filled with bodies, before the empire bled, one man had already won the battle, inside his mind. Skanderbeg was not born a rebel. He was created by the enemy. As a child, he was taken from his homeland and raised inside the Ottoman system itself. Not as a prisoner, as an investment. He was educated where empires manufacture obedience, trained where discipline is absolute, surrounded by men who believed the Ottoman order was not merely powerful, but permanent. He learned their drills, their formations, their command structure, but more importantly, he learned how they thought. He watched how Ottoman commanders behaved when they believed they were winning, how they pressed forward, how they relaxed, how certainty crept into decision-making. He did not study their strength, he studied their assumptions. Skanderbeg did not guess how Ottomans reacted under pressure. He remembered. And when he finally turned against them, he did not fight the empire head-on. He unraveled it. For 14 years, he waged a war that could never be measured by territory. There were no grand victories, no decisive battles, no glorious endings. Only survival, ambush, delay, disappear, strike where discipline mattered most, then vanish before numbers could respond. Every campaign ended the same way. The Ottomans marched inconfident. They marched out frustrated. Nothing decisive, nothing final, until the empire decided this form of resistance was no longer tolerable. By 1457, patience had expired. Survival was no longer acceptable. Skanderbeg had to be erased, not defeated, erased. This was not a raid. It was an execution. The army assembled for Albania was not designed to fight. It was designed to end a problem. 40,000 infantry, veterans hardened by sieges and open battle, men who had crushed cities and broken kingdoms, 20,000 cavalry, shock troops trained to shatter resistance, to turn retreat into slaughter. Another 20,000, engineers, supply handlers, camp followers, the machinery of occupation. This was not a force sent to chase ghosts. It was a force sent to make sure there would be no ghosts left. And guiding them through the mountains was someone who knew Albania better than any map, Skanderbeg's nephew. Blood against blood. He knew every path, every water source, every traditional hiding place. He had grown up hearing stories of these mountains. He believed he knew his uncle's mind. The Ottomans believed betrayal had solved the problem. This time they did not expect resistance. They expected closure. The scale alone sent a message. Resistance was no longer symbolic. It was suicidal. Against this force, no conventional army could stand. Against this force, even survival seemed impossible. And yet, Skanderbeg did not respond the way the Ottomans expected. He did not fortify. He did not retreat to strongholds. He did not gather his forces for a last stand. He did something far more dangerous. He vanished. As 80,000 soldiers marched deeper into Albania, they found no enemy. No scouts, no skirmishes, no harassment. Villages were empty. Watchtowers silent. The empire interpreted silence as victory. What they did not understand was that silence was not absence. It was preparation. Skanderbeg had learned something inside the Ottoman system that no manual could teach. Empires do not collapse when they meet resistance. They collapse when their confidence goes unchallenged, when numbers become routine, when superiority turns into assumption. The army marching into Albania believed the war had already been decided. That belief was the real weapon, because Skanderbeg was not preparing a battle. He was preparing a moment where certainty would collapse, a place where doctrine would fail, where discipline would hesitate, where numbers would become a liability. The Ottomans brought an army built to erase a nation. What they did not realize was that the nation had already decided how the army would die. An army does not disappear by accident. When 80,000 soldiers find nothing in front of them, that is not absence. That is intention. As 80,000 Ottoman soldiers crossed into Albania, they found nothing. No scouts watching from ridgelines, no harassment along the roads, no skirmishes to test their strength, no battle. Villages stood abandoned, doors open, fires cold, watchtowers silent, no flags, no warning horns, no movement. The land itself appeared empty, and that terrified no one, because the Ottomans did not read silence as danger. They read it as victory. Days passed. The army moved deeper into the mountains, unopposed. Boots marched where no enemy answered. Confidence grew with every mile. This was how conquest was supposed to feel. Effortless. The enemy had fled. That was the only conclusion that made sense. But what the Ottomans did not understand was something Skanderbeg had learned long ago. An army does not need to be visible to be present. It needs only to be positioned. While Ottoman commanders relaxed, while supply trains stretched comfortably behind the columns, 8,000 men were moving. Not together, but apart. Small groups, night movement, paths no map recorded, trails horses could not follow. By day, they vanished into forests and caves. By night, they advanced again. No fires, no metal clatter, no voices. An army turned into a shadow. Ottoman scouts reported nothing, and nothing was exactly what the empire wanted to hear. Because certainty is comforting. Certainty tells you the war is already won. The decision was made without debate. The army would rest. They chose a valley. the Tumanishta Valley. Long, narrow, steep on three sides. To Ottoman commanders, it looked perfect. Natural protection from the heights, water nearby, enough space to camp an army that size. A temporary city, safe, comfortable, defensible. To Skanderbeg, it was geometry, angles, slopes, echoes, a place where sound would multiply, where smoke would sink instead of rise, where numbers would press against themselves until they suffocated, a place where retreat would turn into panic. That night, 80,000 men slept. Cooking fires flickered across the valley floor like a constellation. Weapons were cleaned, armor removed. Laughter drifted between tents, the sound of an army that believed danger had passed. Guards were posted, but without urgency. After all, what enemy could approach unseen? Above them, 8,000 men watched. They watched from tree lines, from rock ledges, from narrow paths hidden by shadow. Men who had memorized every slope, every ravine, every way down into the valley. They did not watch with excitement. They watched with calculation. Skanderbeg had chosen this place not because it was dramatic, but because it was inevitable. The Ottomans had walked themselves exactly where he needed them, not by force, by confidence. An army that believes it has already won does not dig deep defenses. It does not prepare for chaos. It sleeps. And sleeping armies do not wake up as armies. That night, 8,000 men did not speak. They did not pray aloud. They did not celebrate. They waited. Because the hardest part of an ambush is not the attack. It is the restraint before it. Above the valley, the terrain closed in like a fist. Below, 80,000 men lay unaware that the ground beneath them had already been chosen for their deaths. They believed they had marched into safety. They had marched into a shape that allowed only one outcome. By dawn, the valley would no longer be a camp. It would be a container, and everything inside it would break. What happened next was not an attack. It was a decision, and once it was made, there was no way back. No fires, no armor clatter, no voices. 8,000 men moved through the darkness as if the mountains themselves were breathing. They did not rely on torches. They did not rely on moonlight. They moved by memory, by paths learned as children, by slopes memorized through generations of survival. A misplaced footstep could mean death. A rolling stone could mean discovery. So there were no mistakes. Men crawled through underbrush, slid down narrow ravines, pressed themselves against rock and earth. Weapons were wrapped in cloth. Water was rationed. Every movement rehearsed in silence. No commands were spoken, only hand signals, only touch. An army reduced to instinct. By 3 a.m, every unit was in position. Archers above the valley walls, infantry hidden along narrow descents, cavalry waiting where the terrain would funnel the enemy. No one celebrated. No one whispered prayers aloud. They waited. Waiting was the hardest part, because every instinct screamed to move. But Skanderbeg understood something that empires often forget. The battle is decided before the first blow lands. Below them, the Ottoman camp slept. Cooking fires burned low. Guards paced without urgency. Laughter drifted between tents. The sounds of an army that believed danger had passed. Dawn approached slowly. Mist crept into the valley, softening edges, blurring distance. Perfect. And then, the horn sounded. Not once, but everywhere. The sound struck the valley walls and came back multiplied. It did not announce direction. It erased it. The echo made the horn seem omnipresent, as if the mountains themselves were attacking. For a fraction of a second, 80,000 men did not understand where the sound came from. And in that moment, clarity vanished. Arrows fell, not in a wave, but in converging storms, from 3 directions at once. Men dropped where they stood, before shields could be raised, before helmets were secured. Horses screamed, rearing and tearing free from their lines. Tents collapsed under panicked bodies. Veteran soldiers froze, not because they were weak, but because discipline requires clarity, and clarity was gone. Officers shouted orders, but commands overlapped. Turkish mixed with Arabic. Voices drowned each other out. Units moved forward and collided with fleeing comrades. Some formed ranks. Others never found their units. The valley filled with movement that had no purpose. Then came the battle cries. Not organized chants, but wild, echoing shouts that bounced endlessly off the stone and slope. It sounded like an army far larger than the 8,000 men who waited above. The Ottomans could not tell how many enemies faced them, only that they were everywhere. Fear spread faster than orders. Men ran into supply wagons, tripped over tent ropes, fell into each other. The camp, designed for rest, became an obstacle course of death. This was not chaos by accident, it was chaos by design. Skanderbeg had chosen this moment carefully. He understood that numbers mean nothing when soldiers cannot orient themselves, that discipline collapses when men cannot identify where danger comes from. As arrows continued to fall, panic fed itself. Some units fired blindly into the mist and struck their own. Others hesitated, waiting for commands that never came. The valley amplified everything: sound, confusion, fear, and above it all, the horn echoed again, not to give orders, but to remind them this was only beginning. The Ottomans had entered the valley believing the war was over. In the space of minutes, they understood something else. They were not under attack. They were inside it. The sun rose slowly over the mountain ridges, and with it, the realization that escape would not be simple, that formation would not save them, that this was not a battle they could win by strength alone. What followed would turn panic into annihilation. But that first sound, that horn at dawn, was the moment reality broke. This was the moment the Ottomans discovered a terrible truth. Numbers do not save you, they trap you. Battle cries echoed endlessly, not once, not twice, but again and again, multiplied by stone, repeated by the valley walls until direction lost meaning. It sounded like an army without edges. Smoke followed. Fires ignited along the slopes, not to burn men, but to blind them. The wind did the rest. It drove the smoke downward, pouring it into the valley floor like water into a bowl. Vision vanished. Breath burned. Men could not see 10 steps ahead. Units fired at movement, at shadows, at noise, and killed brothers. Cries of recognition came too late. Hands were raised. Voices screamed, "We are Ottomans!" The smoke answered with silence and arrows. Commands overlapped. Turkish clashed with Arabic. Orders contradicted each other. Some units advanced, others retreated. Most simply froze. Because armies do not collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they cannot understand what is happening. Order disintegrated. 80,000 men stopped being an army. They became 80,000 individuals, trying to survive. The camp itself betrayed them. Tent ropes tripped fleeing soldiers. Cooking fires burned the fallen. Supply wagons blocked movement. The space that once felt safe now felt impossibly small. The more men pushed, the less room there was to move. Numbers became pressure. Pressure became panic. This was not chaos, this was geometry. The valley gave them nowhere to go. And then, the elite cavalry charged, veterans, the best trained horsemen in the Ottoman army. Men who had broken enemy lines from Anatolia to the Balkans. They formed wedges, they lowered lances. They charged blindly, into smoke, into terrain they could not see, into traps they did not know existed. Horses screamed. Front ranks vanished. Trenches opened beneath hooves. Stakes impaled men and mounts alike. Momentum turned into massacre. Riders crashed into the dead and were thrown from saddles. Those behind had no time to stop. They collided, fell, were trampled. What was meant to be a breakout became a slaughter. Bodies piled where escape had been attempted. Paths narrowed, then closed. The valley became a sealed container of panic. Every direction led to more bodies. Every attempt to regroup collapsed into screaming confusion. Some soldiers fought desperately. Others dropped weapons and ran. Some knelt. Some prayed. Some froze where they stood, unable to process what was happening. Because this was no longer a battle. This was annihilation unfolding in real time. Above them, Skanderbeg's men moved with precision. They did not rush. They did not chase recklessly. They struck where panic was thickest. They understood the truth. Fear moves faster than steel. The Ottomans tried to form defensive squares. Some succeeded. For minutes. Then smoke rolled in again. Arrows fell. Battle cries returned. And the squares dissolved under pressure they could not see. The dead changed the battlefield. Bodies formed barriers. Men slipped in blood and mud. Wounded soldiers screamed beneath the weight of the fallen. The valley floor transformed from ground into obstacle. By noon, resistance no longer existed. Not retreat, not regrouping, not strategy, only survival. Commanders were dead, lost, or unheard. Banners fell. Units dissolved into fragments. The army that had entered the valley no longer functioned as an army. This was the point of no return. The moment when numbers, once a source of confidence, became a liability so overwhelming it could not be escaped. The Ottomans had believed that size guaranteed victory. That discipline would overcome surprise. That fear belonged to the enemy. Instead, fear became the weapon, and the valley became the proof that armies do not die when they are outnumbered. They die when their certainty collapses. What followed would be remembered not as a defeat, but as a warning. Because from this moment forward, the Ottomans were no longer fighting a battle. They were trapped inside one, and the valley was not done with them yet. When the noise finally stopped, when the smoke thinned, When the screams faded into wind, the valley revealed the truth. 30,000 dead, not wounded, not missing, dead. 15,000 captured, chained, disarmed, alive only because the killing had grown inefficient. Less than 1,000 lost on the side that should not have survived at all. The numbers did not make sense. They could not be explained by courage alone, nor by luck, nor by divine intervention. They defied logic. The Tumanishta Valley no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like an ending. Bodies lay so thick they blocked the paths men had tried to flee through. Weapons littered the ground, abandoned by hands that had chosen survival over honor. Broken banners lay in the mud, trampled into irrelevance. An army had entered this valley. An army no longer existed. Skanderbeg stood among the aftermath, not celebrating. He understood something deeper than victory. This battle was never about territory. It was about belief. Across Europe, bells began to ring, not because an army had been destroyed, but because inevitability had been. For years, the Ottoman Empire had advanced like a law of nature. Unstoppable, unquestionable, permanent. Kings feared it. Cities prepared for it. Populations surrendered to it before it arrived. And now, 8,000 men had proven something impossible. The empire could bleed. Empires do not fall when they lose battles. They fall when the world learns they are not invincible. That knowledge travels faster than armies. It crosses borders. It enters courts. It hardens resolve. Because once fear changes sides, everything changes. Messages raced across the continent, from Venice to Rome, from Naples to Vienna. Not tales of heroism, tales of annihilation. An entire Ottoman army erased in 6 hours. Veterans who had survived a dozen campaigns destroyed by men they had dismissed as mountain rebels. For the Ottomans, the loss was not only material, it was psychological. Commanders learned that numbers could betray them, that terrain could think, that discipline could collapse under the right pressure. Never again would they underestimate the mountains. Never again would Albania be dismissed as insignificant. And for Skanderbeg, this was not the end, but it was the moment the empire began to hesitate, the moment expansion slowed, the moment inevitability cracked. On September 2nd, 1457, 8,000 men did more than win a battle. They rewrote expectations. They taught an empire fear. And once fear enters an empire, it never truly leaves.